Varkas and Sydonia, the leaders of the Mount Seifu bandits. As with many characters in Suikoden 1, the game revealed next to nothing of their backstories. However, fortunately for fans of theirs, Varkas and Sidonia's backstories were explored in a short story titled Silver Ending, Golden Beginning, which was included in the Genso Suikoden Short Story Collection 1, a book that released in Japan in August 2000. This short story takes place in the solar year 445 when Sydonia was 10 years old. It covers how Varkas and Sydonia first met and the bond that formed between them. Chapter 1. The story opens with a convoy of carriages belonging to a troupe of performers being attacked by bandits. A boy hid under a sheet in the back of one of the carriages where some dogs and baby monkeys were being kept. He heard the sound of a man screaming outside, followed by a woman shrieking. The sound of swords colliding was unmistakable. He knew they had come under attack. The sound of fighting outside soon stopped, and the boy wondered if anyone else had survived the attack. He wondered if he should try to escape and opened his left hand, which had a blue marking that resembled a chain of leaves. He quickly reconsidered and clenched his hand, realizing it was too dangerous to jump outside without knowing what was happening. The sound of footsteps approached the carriage and the door was pulled open forcefully. A man could be heard saying that it's full of animals, and another man could be heard asking if there was any food. The first man responded by saying that they might find some dog food if they're lucky. The two men laughed as they walked away from the carriage. There was no sign of the carriage door closing, and the boy suppressed his curiosity to peek outside and remained hiding under the sheet. Men could be heard laughing and singing outside as if they were in high spirits. The boy could hear the sound of animals squealing and metal clanking from heavy objects being dragged as the bandits were looting their spoils of victory. The fact that so many men were walking around outside made the boy realize that all of the other members of the troop had been killed. The boy could hear a man's voice berating the other men, telling them that they can't be left alone to do anything. The man entered the carriage and began unlocking the cages the animals were being kept in. The boy began telling himself that he best escape quickly. The man's footsteps drew nearer, and the boy chanted to himself in his head not to look under the cloth. The cloth covering him was lifted, and the man was shocked to see that a child was hiding underneath it. The man held an axe in his hand, and the boy recoiled when he noticed the bloodstains on it. Fearing he might become the axe's next victim, the boy's left hand shone, a white light then emanated from his body, and he disappeared. The man lifted the rest of the cloth in shock. The boy who had been before him only moments ago had vanished. The boy left a strange impression on him. Even though he was dressed wearing simple clothes, he had a thick silver collar wrapped around his neck. The story then reveals that the man's name is Varkas. Varkas tossed his axe to the ground and got out of the carriage in search of the boy. The story now explains a little of Varkas's past. 10 years ago, Varkas and a man named Gwyn left their village and moved to the ruins of an old settlement in Mount Seifu. Initially, their bandit group numbered only a few people, and they stole from lone travelers or those crazy enough to live in the wilderness near the mountain. But as time passed, their numbers grew, and they now numbered over 50. As their numbers became bigger, so did their targets. They now raided caravans and parties of travelers who were attempting to cross the mountain. However, their operation became more difficult and travelers became less frequent as word spread of many people disappearing in the area. The story then cuts back to Varkas. The raid had gone well and the bandits were cheering and celebrating their haul. Considering how much they looted from the carriages, Varkas thought today's results were excellent. The bandits wanted to return to their fort in the mountains and report their success to Gwyn, but Varkas continued searching for the boy as he checked under each of the carriages. Varkas spotted the boy hiding behind the wheel of a carriage, but as soon as the boy spotted him, he vanished. Varkas turned around and saw the boy trying to run into the nearby forest. Varkas chased after him, and just as the boy was about to use his powers to teleport away, Varkas grabbed him by the arm and punched him in the stomach, causing him to collapse. Varkas checked to see if the boy was still breathing before inspecting the silver collar around his neck. The collar was heavy and there was only a small amount of room between the collar and his neck. The collar had no clasp and no obvious way of being removed. Varkas inspected the collar closer and spotted letters engraved in it and a blue stone embedded in it. The collar reminded Varkas more of some kind of restraint rather than being an accessory. Varkas wondered if the boy's power came from the collar, and he momentarily wondered what it would be like if he had that kind of power himself. Varkas quivered and shook his head to rid himself of the thoughts. A voice could be heard asking Varkas if everything was alright. Varkas turned around and spotted Lee behind him. Lee was around 11 or 12 years old, and he was like a younger brother to Varkas. Varkas told Lee that he found a kid. Lee asked if he was still alive, and Varkas responded by saying that he tried to escape into the forest, so he hit him just a little bit. Lee replied that the forest is a dangerous place and smiled at Varkas. Varkas had a bitter look on his face as he wondered out loud what happened to the boy and what the collar was. Lee said he found a blanket in one of the carriages and told Varkas to wait while he goes and gets it. Varkas looked down at the boy and said that he thinks he's found something troublesome as Chapter 1 comes to an end. Chapter 2. Chapter 2 begins with the boy waking up inside a house in the bandits' village. A rope had been tied around his blanket to prevent him from getting out of the bed. He focused his thoughts and his left hand began to glow, and in an instant he was out of bed and rolling on the floor. He opened the door just enough to peek outside and spotted someone cooking in the kitchen across the living room. The food smelled good and he thought about asking if he could have some, but he immediately changed his mind and closed the door as a terrible memory came rushing back to him. The boy remembered how the leader of the troop he was travelling with abducted him from his home and abused his powers for his own gain. The boy took some solace in knowing that the troop leader had been killed in the bandit attack. The boy looked outside the window and saw a small garden with overgrown grass below. He couldn't spot any people around the garden, so he focused his thoughts to his hand and teleported outside. The house the boy was being kept in was near the centre of the village. The day was drawing to an end and the roads were still busy with bandits. The boy realised his only chance to escape was to make his way to the nearby forest. He carefully moved from house to house, taking cover behind each house and keeping out of the bandits' view. He suddenly felt someone squeezing his right arm and heard a man's voice shouting at him, wanting to know how he got in here. The boy turned around and saw a man adorned in colourful garments, with rings on each of his fingers adorned with jewels. Behind the man were two other men carrying a number of swords. The man lifted the boy and started shaking him as he continued shouting at him, demanding an answer and wanting to know what he had come here for. The man squeezed his fingers into the boy's arms with such force that he cried out in pain. At the same time, Varkas was heading to the bandit leader Gwyn's house. After returning from their raid earlier, the bandits divided their plunder up equally, but when Varkas momentarily took his leave, Gwyn had seized all of the loot for himself. When Varkas found out what Gwyn had done, he became annoyed. Varkas didn't think it was fair for Gwyn to take all of the loot for himself just because he was in charge, and he couldn't understand why it wasn't being distributed equally, especially the weapons, as they lived in a dangerous area where they could be attacked by wild beasts at any moment. Varkas spotted the boy lifted in the air and being squeezed in Gwyn's muscular arms. The boy was in agony, and the face he was making reminded Varkas of the same face he made earlier before using his teleportation powers. Varkas didn't think it would be a good idea for Gwyn to find out about the boy's power and rushed over calling out Gwyn's name. Gwyn and the boy both turned their heads to Varkas, and Varkas asked what the boy had done. Gwyn responded by asking Varkas who the boy was. Varkas replied that he found him in one of the carriages earlier and brought him back. Gwyn frowned at Varkas, and Varkas asked him to let the boy go, promising that he'd look after him and that the boy won't bother him again. Gwyn swung the boy towards Varkas and told him that he'd better keep the boy disciplined because he'd kill the boy if he gets in the way again. As Gwyn turned his back and began walking away, Varkas asked him why he wasn't sharing the swords with everyone else like he used to. Gwyn responded by saying that they've been successful without good quality weapons so far, so the men don't need them. Varkas responded by telling him that's only because we've been employing good strategies, and reminded Gwyn that there's more than enough weapons to share. Gwyn snorted at Varkas as he told him that's all the more reason not to share the weapons. Gwyn added that it's too dangerous to give high quality weapons to people who are able to win fights with good strategy alone. Varkas looked at Gwyn in disbelief and reminded him that the stronger they are, the more reliable they are. With a bitter expression on his face, Gwyn replied that better quality weapons won't make them more reliable, only harder to control. With a bitter expression on his face, Gwyn replied that better quality weapons won't make them more reliable, only harder to control. Gwyn then turned his back and walked away as Varkas looked down at the boy with a bitter smile. Varkas began walking home as he carried the boy in his arms so that he couldn't escape. He told the boy that there are a lot of nasty people living here and that it would be better if he didn't run off alone. As Varkas entered his home, he put the boy down and shouted at Lee that you let him run away. Lee responded by asking how he escaped, since they were so careful tying him down with the rope. Varkas told Lee to give the boy something to eat. He patted the boy on the back and told him that he won't hurt him, but asked him to please behave himself. Lee asked Varkas if he wanted any food, but Varkas declined, saying that he needed to go out for a while. Lee handed the boy a plate of rice with stir-fried meat and vegetables and told him that they had a big harvest today, before quickly apologizing when he realized it was the boy's carriage they had attacked. Lee told him that he's lucky to be alive and that he has Varkas to thank for that. Lee told the boy that Varkas is a good person and that Varkas has been taking care of him for many years. He continued explaining that he used to be a troublesome child and everyone had enough of him, but Varkas had patience and took care of him. The boy let out a faint laugh at Lee's comments. Lee then explained to him that Gwyn is the leader of the group here. He's much bigger and stronger than Varkas, but unlike Varkas, he's impatient and doesn't treat people well. Lee then told the boy not to try and escape again, as the forest is full of tigers and wolves, but he'll be safe as long as he stays in Varkas' house. Lee then introduced himself and asked the boy what his name was. The boy responded that he doesn't want to be called his name anymore. Lee tilted his head and wondered what the boy was talking about. He then told the boy that he should ask Varkas to give him a new name. Lee then made the boy laugh by explaining the happenings of the fort with exaggerated hand gestures. Varkas returned as the two finished their food as Chapter 2 comes to an end. Chapter 3. Chapter 3 opens with Varkas sitting by the boy's bedside while he was still asleep. He put his fingers on the collar around the boy's neck and held a ring in his other hand. Varkas had went to apologize to the other bandits last night for being unable to convince Gwyn to share the weapons they found. While there, Varkas found a ring in a pile of leftover junk that hadn't been taken. The ring looked familiar, and just like the collar around the boy's neck, the ring was also engraved with letters and had a blue stone embedded in it. The bandits told Varkas that the ring was taken from the best dressed person from the troops' carriage. Varkas compared the ring to the boy's collar. The boy woke and sat up. Varkas told him he wanted to show him the ring as he suspects it's related to the collar. Varkas was proud of the fact that he could read. He was the third son of a farmer and he was taught how to read by a priest when he was younger. The lessons only lasted a few months, but he was able to read as long as the writing was simple. The engraving on the ring appeared to be a name consisting of 4 syllables. Varkas brought the ring closer to his eyes and began reading it out loud. Sai-do. The boy reached for the ring to stop him, but he was too late. Varkas had finished speaking the name Sydonia. The ring shone with a light so bright that it blinded Varkas, and Varkas was so surprised that he threw the ring on the floor. When the light faded, Varkas spotted Sydonia on the floor by his feet. Sydonia was holding his throat and glaring at the ring. He was in so much pain that he couldn't even stand up. Varkas looked at Sydonia and the ring with a confused expression before quickly realizing that the collar around Sydonia's neck was a magical shock collar designed to control him. If Sydonia ever tried to escape, the bearer of the ring could cause him pain until he obeyed. A thought ran through Varkas' mind that if he held the ring, Sydonia's power would belong to him, but Varkas quickly shook the thought from his head. Varkas picked Sydonia up off the floor and placed him back into the bed. Sydonia had a frightened look on his face when Varkas picked the ring up off the floor. Varkas then told Sydonia that he thinks he understands that if he uses the ring, he would suffer. Sydonia nodded, and Varkas replied that he hates this kind of thing. He opened Sydonia's hand and placed the ring in it. Sydonia was confused by the gesture, but Varkas told him to take the ring. It was obvious to Varkas that Sydonia had suffered from the ring's magic many times before, and he had no desire to do the same. Varkas then asked Sydonia if that was his name. Sydonia nodded, and Varkas introduced himself. He told Sydonia that he's worried about the collar and wondered how they could remove it from his neck. He jokingly asked if they should try breaking it off with his axe, but Sydonia trembled at the suggestion. Later that day, Varkas and Sydonia visited Lee's house. Varkas asked Lee if there was a way to remove Sydonia's collar. Lee took a close look at the collar and commented that the collar doesn't appear to be made from a strong material and they could probably break it open if they got a blade under it, but all they have left are thin kitchen knives. Varkas asked Lee what he meant and Lee responded that Gwyn was here moments ago and he took away everyone's weapons. Lee continued by saying that Gwyn told him he'd return the weapons only when they needed them. But Lee was worried that if the wolves and tigers in the nearby forest attacked, he'd be their first prey. Varkas grew angry and asked Lee why he'd hand the weapons over to Gwyn. Lee kicked the floor in frustration and asked Varkas what he was supposed to do against Gwyn. Lee then commented that maybe Hodai could help them remove the collar as he has a lot of tools at his disposal. Varkas told them that he was going to speak with Gwyn and Lee told him not to be foolish, that all it will do is cause trouble. Varkas told him not to worry about the collar for now and not to do anything stupid while he's gone. After Varkas left the house, Lee turned to Sydonia and said they should try to remove the collar before Varkas returns home. The two ran to Hodai's house. Hodai was an apothecary and Lee suspected he might have the tools or know-how to remove Sydonia's collar. Lee opened the door and called out Hodai's name. Lee told him what he needed and Hodai fetched his toolbox. Lee asked him if Gwyn had been to his house recently. Lee's comments made Hodai stumble and fall to the floor and the contents of his toolbox spilled in front of him. Sydonia found a small mallet and chisel among the scattered tools. Lee sat Sydonia on the floor and began tapping the collar carefully. Lee then told Hodai that he never answered his question about Gwyn, but remarked that if Gwyn had come, he probably said something nasty anyway. Hodai shook his head in shock and told Lee to be careful about speaking ill of Gwyn. Lee responded that Gwyn isn't here and nobody is listening. Hodai was a timid man who was too scared to speak against Gwyn. Lee commented that he doesn't have any respect for Gwyn since he's a bully. Hodai asked Lee why him and Varkas don't leave the mountain if they're so sick of Gwyn. Lee responded that if Varkas wanted to leave, he'd follow him. At the same time, Varkas had just arrived at Gwyn's house. Gwyn was sitting like a king in a room with long carpets and a wall embroidered with flowers and feathers. There were a few people among their group that had recently begun to question Gwyn and refused to listen to him, and he believed that they needed to be disciplined. Varkas tried to argue his point that they live in a dangerous area and asked what they're going to do if they're attacked without warning. Gwyn gave out a loud, vulgar laugh as he told Varkas that he's been far too lenient. Varkas asked him if he plans to make more changes. Gwyn smiled and averted his gaze. Varkas began to wonder what Gwyn was afraid of, but before he could speak, a sharp blow struck Varkas's head and he fell to the floor with blurry vision. Gwyn told Varkas not to speak back to him and ordered him to get out. Varkas knew that Gwyn hadn't heard a word he said and wondered what was coming over him, as he used to be more considerate of his fellow bandits. His vision still blurry, Varkas made his way out of Gwyn's house and spotted Lee and Sydonia walking towards him. Sydonia ran over to Varkas as Lee watched from a distance. Sydonia was so overcome with joy at his collar being removed that he didn't even notice Varkas's injuries. As Sydonia touched his neck with his fingers, he told Varkas how happy he was, and Varkas responded that he was glad. Lee waved and told them he was heading home. Noticing a wound on the back of Varkas's head, Sydonia asked Varkas what happened and asked him if Gwyn had hit him. Varkas assured him that he was fine. As the two began walking back to Varkas's house, Sydonia whispered to Varkas, asking if it would be better for him if he didn't have to deal with Gwyn. Sydonia then whispered that he'll kill Gwyn, that he'd use his power to teleport into Gwyn's room at night and stab him in the chest with a dagger. Varkas couldn't believe what Sydonia was suggesting and questioned Sydonia if that's how the people he was travelling with had so many weapons and riches. Varkas responded by telling Sydonia that he doesn't have to do that and he doesn't want Gwyn to die. He revealed that he considered using Sydonia's powers for his own good when he first found him, but decided against it. Sydonia asked him what he wanted to do, and Varkas replied that Gwyn is a problem, but he wants to think about what to do about it for a while. Varkas then patted Sydonia on the head and ruffled his hair. As the two walked away, Varkas let out a discreet sigh towards the sky as Chapter 3 comes to an end. Chapter 4. Chapter 4 begins with Sydonia being awoken during the night by the sound of Varkas and Gwyn speaking in the next room. Sydonia pressed his ears against the door to listen. Gwyn appeared to be in a good mood and was sharing a drink with Varkas as a way of apologizing for hitting him. In contrast to Gwyn's cheerful mood, Varkas's tone was cold. He told Gwyn that his method of doing things was wrong and imposing restrictions won't win the men over. Varkas commented that with the way Gwyn is going, nobody will follow his lead. Gwyn responded that what he needs is for people to do as they're told, because if he lets them do as they please, then they won't be able to work together when the time comes. Varkas told Gwyn that he's wrong. The two argued about Gwyn's method of leadership, and Gwyn commented that they're never going to see eye to eye on the matter. He then told Varkas that sooner or later they're going to come to blows. Suddenly, Varkas began choking and collapsed to the ground. Gwyn told Varkas that he's a dangerous man and he shouldn't have let him live this long. Sydonia opened his bedroom door and saw that Gwyn had his sword pointed at Varkas on the floor. Sydonia called out Varkas' name, and in a faint voice, Varkas told him to run away. Gwyn pointed his sword at Sydonia, but the moment he thrust his sword, Sidonia's left hand shone, and in an instant he was on Gwyn's back with his arms wrapped around Gwyn's neck. Gwyn tried to shake Sydonia off and swung his sword, but his sword hit the table, knocking the bottle and drinks to the floor. Gwyn let go of his sword and slammed himself backwards against the wall, but still Sydonia wouldn't let go. Sydonia cried out for Varkas to get up, but his body was too weak to move. Sydonia bit Gwyn's arm with all his might as Gwyn tried to punch him. Varkas tried to reach for Gwyn's sword, but his vision began to fail as he fell in and out of consciousness. Sydonia continued to cry out for Varkas, and with the last of his strength, Varkas forced himself to his feet and thrust the sword through Gwyn's body as Sydonia teleported off him. Varkas collapsed to the floor and heard Sydonia call out his name as he lost consciousness. The commotion had woken the neighbours, and everyone stood in shock by the door when they spotted Gwyn laying on the floor gasping for air in a pool of blood, with Varkas collapsed beside him with a sword in his hand. Lee pushed his way past the crowd and asked Sydonia what happened and where was Varkas hurt. Sydonia replied that he's not injured, but that he drank something and it seems his drink was poisoned. Lee turned to Hodai, who was standing by the door, and ordered him to bring an antidote. Hodai stood frozen, unsure who to help. He only had enough time to save one person, Varkas, who needed an antidote, or Gwyn, who was bleeding out, gasping for air. Lee took Gwyn's sword from Varkas' hands and told Hodai that if he tries to help Gwyn, things will get messy. Hodai looked at Gwyn, who was gasping for air and trying to speak, and then turned his eyes to Varkas and Sydonia. Hodai then stepped back and said he'd get the antidote. Lee asked the other men what they planned to do, but none of them answered. He ordered one of them to carry Varkas to bed and another to fetch water and boil it. Varkas was out cold for 3 days and 3 nights, but he eventually recovered thanks to Hodai's antidote, an antidote for the poison that Gwyn had forced him to make. Sydonia remained by Varkas' side the entire time he was out. Varkas awoke and Lee told him that it was unanimously decided that he would be the next leader of the Mount Seifu bandits. Varkas responded that he's not suited to lead, and Lee replied that it was already decided. Sydonia added that he has also decided that from now on he also works for Varkas. He explained to Varkas that he used to be alone, that all anyone ever wanted was his power, but nobody ever wanted him, except for Varkas, who helped him take off the collar and be free. He said he wants to work for Varkas, unless Varkas doesn't want him. Varkas replied that's not what he's saying, and asked Sydonia if he's looking for another master. Sydonia replied that he already sees Varkas as his leader, and he's sure that there's someone somewhere that Varkas will one day see as a leader, but until that day comes, Varkas should be the leader. Lee chimed in by saying that's right, and Varkas wryly smiled as he agreed, but Sydonia added that even if Varkas does find a leader, he'll still only listen to what Varkas says. Varkas patted Sidonia's head, and as he began to fall back asleep, he thought to himself that he'll do whatever he has to do to keep this child smiling, even if it means becoming the leader. Lee and Sydonia left the room in silence so that Varkas could rest, as a golden ray of sunlight shone through the window. And that's the end of Varkas and Sidonia's backstory. As I mentioned at the beginning, this backstory came from a short story titled Silver Ending, Golden Beginning from the Genso Suikoden Short Story Collection 1 that released in Japan in August 2000. So just a little note about Sidonia's teleportation powers. As you all know, Sydonia had no rune equipped in Suikoden 1. According to this short story, the chain leaf marking on his left hand glows just as a rune does whenever he teleports, so that does strongly hint that his power comes from a rune. but this short story never mentions the word rune. None of the pages about him in the Kiwami Encyclopedia mention the word rune either. On top of that, Varkas points out that he heard rumours of people being born with mysterious powers. There is an example of this with Sarah in Suikoden 3 being born with a flowing rune and having an innate ability to read Sindarin as well as being able to sense Sindar runes. So does Sidonia's power come from a rune, and was he born with that rune? Or is it a natural mysterious ability he was born with like Sarah? Who knows, but if it is in fact a rune, which it probably is, we may see it in Starleaf. Anyway, there were only 6 more short stories to cover from the books. We're nearing the end, and if you've been waiting on any specific character from the remaining stories, you won't have to wait much longer. The next video will be covering Meg's short story, and after that we'll be covering Klaus Windermere's short story. If there are any other Suikoden or non-related Suikoden topics you want me to make videos on once we're finished working our way through the books, do let me know. Thanks for watching guys, and I'll catch you on the next one.